the Harriman Institute at Columbia. This is as part of our ongoing collaborative series between the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center, our New York City Russia Public Policy.
Josh, you're muted.
Sorry, apologies about that. The YouTube started in the background. Okay, so welcome. It's a good introduction to welcome everybody who's joining us on YouTube as well. Today's topic is incredibly timely. It's on the election. It's an election debrief, and the topic for today is what will a second Trump term mean for U.S.-Russia relations? We're joined by an amazing collection of panelists here who Elise will be introducing before each of them speak. I just wanted to quickly let you know about the logistics, how this was perceived for those of you who are new. This is a webinar. We're all very used to webinars at this point in time, but we're going to ask each of our panelists to speak, give some opening remarks for about 8 to 10 minutes each. Elise will introduce each of them in turn before they speak. Once they're done speaking, Elise and I will moderate the Q&A to ask questions to the panelists. The nice thing about the webinar format is you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the page to pose questions at any time. Elise and I will keep an eye on that. And after the panelists have all finished their introductory remarks, we'll draw from there, combine questions, put our own questions to the panelists as well. If you're on YouTube watching and you want to leave a question, you can do that in the comments section on YouTube. Beyond that, we thank you very much all for joining us here today. I think it's going to be an incredibly illuminating discussion. I'm very much looking forward to what our amazing collection of panelists have to say. We will go, even though we started at 12:15, we will go till 1:30. So there'll be a hard stop at 1:30. So we're looking forward to having you with us for the next hour plus. I'm going to pass it off to, and last but not least, I want to, of course, thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for the generous funding that they have been providing over the past years for us to continue providing this series. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Elise Giuliano. Elise?
Okay, thanks, Josh. And again, thanks to our panelists. Really looking forward to what each of you has to say today. We're going to start with Angela Stent, who is Senior Advisor to the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies and a Professor Emerita of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown University. She is also a Senior Non-Resident Fellow at the Brookings Institution and co-chairs its Hewitt Forum on Post-Soviet Affairs. She is a Senior Advisor to the United States Institute of Peace. From 2004 to 2006, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And from 1999 to 2001, she served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State. Angela?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with this distinguished crowd. I'm a little bit hesitant because I have to tell you, we can talk about what U.S.-Russian relations might look like under President Trump, the next administration, but really we have no idea. We maybe have a few hints. So let me just start with the Kremlin. We know that Putin and his colleagues, they wanted Trump to win, even if Putin said different things during the campaign. But I think they still must have some mixed feelings about this. So we have Putin did congratulate Donald Trump on his win at the Valdai Forum about 10 days ago. He said some flattering things about how Trump had survived an assassination attempt. He admired him for this. But then when the Trump people said that there'd been a phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin last week, the Kremlin then denied it. Dmitry Peskov denied it. And at the same time that Putin was flattering Trump, one of his favorite propagandists, Olga Skabayeva, on her evening TV show, had a very scurrilous, derogatory, and salacious report on Melania Trump, the future First Lady, and her time as a model when she was younger. And again, these Russian TV propagandists don't freelance, so they must have somehow believed that it was okay to do that. So I would say at the moment, you have signs of the Kremlin trolling Donald Trump, but also having praised him too. And then we're not quite sure exactly what they think they're expecting. Why did the Kremlin want Trump to win? I think that's quite clear. It's really the same as in 2016 and in 2020. You know, they prefer what they see as a chaotic, declining America where democracy isn't functioning properly. But they're also wary because of their experience with Trump in his first administration. Because even though he flattered Vladimir Putin and said that he admired him and said that he believed Putin over his own intelligence agencies on the question of Russian interference in the 2016 campaign, what did they actually got? They got expulsion of diplomatic personnel. They got rafts of sanctions under the CAATSA sanctions. There was a firefight between US troops and allied troops and the Wagner group in Syria, where at least 200 Russian mercenaries were killed. The Trump administration withdrew from the INF Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, from the Open Skies Treaty. And so really the Trump administration didn't deliver what Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin might have believed that they were going to do in the first term. And what they did deliver was lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine, which was something that the Obama administration had refused to do. Now, what's different, I think, is this time, I think Putin believes that he is in the driver's seat in terms of the war in Ukraine. And I know we're going to hear more about that from our colleagues, including our Ukrainian colleagues. He believes that Russia is winning in this war on the battlefield. He believes that Trump wants a deal with him on this war more than Putin, needs it, because Trump has promised his supporters, those who voted for him, that he's going to end all wars. In fact, he promised to end the war in Ukraine 24 hours after he was elected, before he was inaugurated, and clearly he hasn't delivered on that yet. If Putin were willing to sit down and negotiate with Donald Trump, then I think he would demand that Ukraine recognize the incorporation or the annexation of the 4 territories, none of which Russia, of course, fully controls. He would demand that Ukraine agree never to join NATO and that it become demilitarized. So his demands are essentially those of the future Vice President J.D. Vance. And so that, I think, those would be his opening bids. But I think he would also demand that the United States lift all the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia since the February 24th, 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I do not believe that Putin will agree to begin negotiations with Trump. And we know that Trump wants these negotiations to begin until he believes that he can get most of this. He can hold out. Again, he believes that he is in the driver's seat at the moment, even though Russia, as we know, is losing up to 1,200 men a day in this ongoing brutal war in Ukraine. But we also know that the Russian economy is on a wartime footing, that the Russian economy has high growth rates at the moment. It has other problems, but in fact, it's doing much better, maybe than people had anticipated a couple of years ago. So again, there's not that much pressure on him to negotiate. And of course, we know that even though Russia has a manpower shortage, it has these North Korean soldiers fighting now in the Kursk region and maybe in other parts during this war. So it can sit back. And I think the other thing to say about the Kremlin is that it understands that Trump can be unpredictable. And therefore, again, there's an unknown factor there that they have to deal with. Now, what is it that Donald Trump himself might want? He clearly wants to come out of any negotiation with Russia on the Russia-Ukraine war appearing to be a winner, that he's not a loser and that he's won in these negotiations. I think he wants to sit down with Vladimir Putin and negotiate with him without Ukraine and without the Europeans being present. And that obviously could be a big problem, both for Ukraine and for Europe. Of course, that's what Putin wants too. He wants just a bilateral negotiation with Trump. And I think if Ukraine were forced to cede territory under Trump, how far would a Trump administration be willing to go to give Ukraine the security guarantees that it would need, tight security guarantees if it were to make these concessions to Russia? And we know that they would be short of NATO membership, because I think there's no way that a Trump administration would be in favor of Ukraine having a real NATO perspective. So how far would they be willing? What kind of guarantees would they be willing to give Ukraine? And that is still an unknown there. I think Trump would be interested in lifting sanctions on Russia. He's already said that, because I think he still envisages grand business deals with Russia, the kind that he envisaged before he became president in 2016, and he still has hopes of having a robust economic relationship with Russia. Again, it remains to be seen whether he can do that, how much he can do by executive order. And, we in the United States, we have huge questions about how much Donald Trump and those around him will be able to change the way that the United States is run, its constitution, its system, during the 4 years that he'll be in power. Now, if we look at the appointees that he's nominated so far for positions, Marco Rubio, if he's indeed confirmed as Secretary of State, he is a Russia hawk. He has been fairly firm in supporting Ukraine, although he's also questioned how much money is going to Ukraine, which one has to do, I think, if one's a Trump appointee. The question would be, how far would he be willing, and the State Department, in these negotiations? Congressman Waltz, the National Security Advisor, he too has been pretty tough on Russia, and hasn't said very much to indicate that he's changed his positions. On the other hand, if you look at the nominees for the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense Hesketh, if you look at Tulsi Gabbard, again nominated to be the head of the DNI, I think it's much harder to predict what their stance on these issues would be. What about arms control and strategic stability? Would Russia agree to resume strategic stability talks with the US, which of course they've refused to do, at least for the past year? Will there be a follow-on to the New START agreement? We know that the previous Trump administration insisted that the Chinese be involved in any future strategic arms control negotiations, and the Chinese refused to do so last time. So I think we have to also assume that it's possible that under Trump, the entire edifice of the US-Russian arms control system will have ended, the last remaining one being, of course, negotiations on strategic weapons. Now, do the Trump people believe that they can persuade Russia to distance itself from China? We know that China will be the major focus of their foreign policy. That's what they've said coming in. And I think if they believe that, then I think they're deluded, because I think at the present time, there's very little chance that Russia would change its stance towards China, even if the US-Russian relationship somehow improves. And I think the final point I want to make is about the kind of more general point about how the Trump administration views Russia. So I wrote a book a few years ago called The Limits of Partnership, where I examined how each American administration since the collapse of the Soviet Union has come into office believing it can reset relations with Russia. It can find a better way to deal with Russia than its predecessor did. And that's true of Clinton, it's true of Bush, it's true of Obama, obviously, where it was explicit. And it was, of course, true of the first Trump administration, too. Only the Biden administration came in saying it didn't want to use the term reset. But still, there was an attempt, at least in the beginning. You had a Biden-Putin summit. And the reason why all of these attempts have ended badly, they failed, is because of fundamentally different worldviews between the United States, irrespective of whether it's a Democratic or a Republican administration, and the views in the Kremlin, particularly since Putin came to power. Now, what we can say now is maybe the next Trump administration doesn't have such a fundamentally different worldview than the people in power in the Kremlin. It's a transactional view. It's a view that is not based on morality, on the belief in the promotion of democracy. It's a view that, where pragmatic business deals through the lens of deals like that, it's going to approach Russia. And that isn't that different from the view in the Kremlin, even though, I mean, we can say that Putin also has this kind of messianic view, particularly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But still, they are pragmatic, they're transactional, they are out to get what, what is good for Russia, even if they have a very hostile view of the United States. So it might be possible to make deals and for there to be a reset, but a rather different reset than the previous US administrations have attempted to have. And I think the other point I'll make here, and I would encourage you to read Fiona Hill's long interview in Politico a couple of weeks ago, is we also now, if you look at Elon Musk and the role that he's playing apparently in negotiations, he was on a phone call with Zelensky, he's in the room when appointments are being made, he has at the moment what appears to be an enormous amount of influence. We have our own rising class of oligarchs in the United States whose role is not that dissimilar from some of the oligarchs in Russia, and where there might be more compatibility between the way that the US approaches Russia and the way that Russia approaches the US. So, that could change the equation. It could mean that it could lead to a better relationship between the US and Russia based on very different premises. But of course, I might be completely wrong here. I'm also skeptical about how much Trump will be able to improve relations with Russia, given how low the relationship has sunk and given all the obstacles towards doing that. And finally, I'll just say what Putin wants and what he's wanted since he came to power is an equal relationship of unequals. He wants the United States to treat Russia as an equal, even though in many ways we can still say that it isn't. And he wants the US to agree to the proposition that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, and that Russia's neighbors, particularly Ukraine, should understand that and not try and move westward. We have to ask ourselves, would he be able to get either of those things from a Trump administration? And we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you very much, Angela. Now we will hear from Catherine Stoner, who is the Mosbacher Director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and a Senior Fellow at CDDRL and the Center on International Security and Cooperation at FSI. From 2017 to 2021, she served as FSI's Deputy Director. She is a professor of political science by courtesy at Stanford, and she teaches in the Department of Political Science and in the Program on International Relations, as well as in the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy program. She is also a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Catherine?
Thank you. I will vehemently agree with Angela on almost everything, and only one thing did I disagree on. But I think I feel like every time we have these kinds of convenings at the beginning of a new administration, somebody says at some point, we are at the lowest point in Russia-US relations in the post-communist period. So it'll be me this time. What is Biden's legacy for the incoming once and future president? Ukraine, of course, until recently thought to be in a deadlock. Biden, probably a year too late, just over the weekend, allowed Ukraine to use ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System that will enable them to hit targets about 200 miles or so from the Ukraine border. I hear a lot in the press that this isn't going to be a big deal because the Russians have moved their planes, and it's interesting to see how this just gets picked up by one media source after another. And that's true. They probably have done that, but they can't move infrastructure. And of course, that you need fuel to fly planes. And they're fighting in Kursk Oblast, part of which Ukraine still occupies, is obviously within the ATACMS range. So trying to give, as Tony Blinken said this weekend, as much money as the US government is authorized to do to Ukraine before the inauguration on January 20th. The US government can't turn on a dime, so I don't think that Biden's policies on Ukraine can be quickly reversed by the Trump administration. but they may well be reversed. Okay, the second thing is a sanctions regime that is the heaviest on the biggest economy that sanctions have ever been put on. Obviously, U.S. and European sanctions on Russia and the Russian economy. Again, the sort of popular narrative, I think, is that, oh, it hasn't worked. I think it's beginning to work, and sanctions are imprecise. They take a long time. If you thought the goal was to get Russia out of Ukraine just by use of sanctions alone, well, then they failed. But that's not the goal. It was really to slow down Putin's war machine, and we're starting to see that. And I'll get to the economy in just a minute. We have an uncertain Europe, another legacy of the Biden administration left to Trump. An uncertain future, perhaps, for NATO, since Trump is a NATO doubter. But I do think even with control of Congress and a Republican Senate, it would be very, very hard for Trump to withdraw the United States from NATO. That said, could fail as leadership in NATO, but I think that full withdrawal is extremely unlikely. We do, though, have Germany in flux currently, and Scholz appears to have called Putin a few days ago. This upset the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, because it ends Putin's complete isolation from Western leaders. But of course, it had no effect anyway, so it's not clear. I'd be interested, actually, Angela, you've followed German politics much more closely than I do, or any of the other panelists, make of that, what the point of that was. I think Putin has run laps around Macron and Scholz and embarrassed both of them. And then, of course, this axis of convenience, the challenge of China and of the alliance. And I think we can start calling it an alliance between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, having North Korean troops fight on Russia's behalf against Ukraine is an intriguing, worrisome development. But it's also worrisome from the point of view of the Russian war machine. If you have to call on North Korea for troops, then that may be a reasonable indication that things are not going quite as well as expected. And the burn rate of Russian troops in Ukraine currently is extremely high. With Trump, if this is the legacy, Ukraine, sanctions regime, uncertain Europe, NATO, the challenge of China, and this axis of convenience, what might happen? Well, the policies may change and probably will under Trump. The other question, though, I wonder is if U.S. interests may change, and that's, of course, a harder thing from one administration to another, even when it's such an about face as this one. I don't know much about what President Trump truly believes. I'm not sure any of us do, and I think he changes his mind pretty frequently, which gets back to the unpredictability question that Angela raised. That's likely in the minds of Kremlin decision makers. But his policy of America first in the past was America alone, and America withdrawing, and that provides an opportunity for Russia, for China in the world, and I think that. Partly, we saw a resurrection of Russia in global affairs because of the withdrawal, not just under Trump, but really the step back even under the Obama administration. You might remember leading from behind, and Trump being America first, and Biden also being somewhat tentative. So we think of Russia as quite isolated. It's not. It's isolated from the West. But it is not isolated from the East or the global South, where it has actually a fair amount of leverage, a number of friends that it has developed over 10 to 15 years, not just the last 2, 3, or 4. And I think the U.S. has to re-engage in the world and show leadership in the world, and I would not expect that to be Trump's policy. America first means America alone. Or America absent. Okay, so in terms of the, I'll just try to limit it to, I guess, 3 or 4 points. In terms of Ukraine, obviously the biggest issue, what's likely to happen? Well, I think that President Trump means it when he says he wants to end this war, and I think that there is a lot of support, unfortunately, among I don't know if it's majority of Americans that we can say anymore, but a lot of Americans to do that. And I think that as much as I agree with certain policies of the Biden administration, I think the sort of drip, drip, drip of weapons and money, they haven't actually explained very well what they're doing in Ukraine and why we are still supporting Ukraine and why this is so important. And so a lot of Americans simply don't understand it and would rather pay attention to problems at home. And this presumably partly explains the support for Trump and his focus on domestic issues. Don't forget also that Ukraine was integral to Trump's first impeachment in 2020. He views and continues to view Ukraine as a corrupt country, and he thought that it would be malleable enough to, quote, do him a favor, if you remember, and investigate Joe Biden. I think all of this is problematic. He has insulted Zelensky in public, but then being very friendly with him in private, which is often Trump's way. So what I worry about is, well, of course, this war could be ended in an hour if Vladimir Putin simply left Ukraine, which would be the morally right thing to do, because they have absolutely no business, the Russians, being there in the first place, or having attacked now 34 months ago. So there's no great mystery to how one could end this, right? That's one option. The other is forcing a weakened Ukraine to, with its own internal divisions, which hopefully Volodymyr will talk about a little bit more, to trade land for peace. And increasingly, I think that we've heard American policymakers and former American policymakers, including one of my colleagues here, Condoleezza Rice at Stanford, say things like that, East and West Germany eventually were reunited, and so Ukraine may just have to bite the bullet, and look at South Korea, it prospered. Okay, but with a strong security guarantee. And my worry is that the Trump administration is not going to provide that strong security guarantee. It's not going to be full membership in NATO. And I think the only sort of good outcome for Ukraine is to get that strong security guarantee, so that Putin or his successor someday doesn't come back, rearm, and reinvade Ukraine, just as they did after 2014. So I think that's very worrisome. I worry that Ukraine may be forced to the negotiating table because they won't see the big weapons shipments that we have provided. However, one bright possibility is that people in the Trump administration, and Rubio obviously knows this, and so Mike Waltz, the presumptive national security advisor, is that most of the money that we, quote unquote, give Ukraine actually stays in the United States and goes to weapons factories that are here in the US, and those factories are sometimes in the constituencies of members of Congress. The Republicans will have a slim majority in Congress. If our inflation goes wild, then Republicans may lose Congress in 2 years. So they may not withdraw all that money. Okay, if there is a peace, obviously sanctions relief and possible reincorporation. I know I'm at 10 minutes now. Wow, that was fast. The one point of disagreement I have with Angela, I suppose, is on the effect inside Russia currently, and that is with the central bank interest rate now being up around 21%, and predictions of growth in the next year to 2 years being somewhere between 0.5 and 1.5%, which is their most recent forecast. So I think they're facing a real possibility of stagflation. They have casualty rates that are very, very high, and a hesitancy to mobilize more troops from Russia. So I think that's essentially what we have before us. There's not an easy answer. I think America first, it means Russia's resurrection as a great disruptor, and continue to be a great disruptor under the next administration.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And now we will hear from Volodymyr Dubovic, who is the director of the Center for International Studies at Odessa by Michnikov National University. He has conducted research at the Kennan Institute, at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars twice, and at the Center for International Security Studies at the University of Maryland. He's also taught at the University of Washington in Seattle and at St. Edward's University and University of Texas at Austin. He is the co-author of Ukraine and European Security and has published numerous articles on US-Russian relations, regional and international security, and Ukraine's foreign policy. His areas of expertise include Ukraine, transatlantic relations, the US, and Black Sea security. Volodymyr?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to this audience and in this great company of distinguished colleagues and experts in the field. It's a great pleasure and honor for me. Well, let me say that the mood in Ukraine is pretty, downtrodden. It's gloomy. Ukrainians, it reflects the situation on the front line. Russia has an initiative. They have the ball. They're pushing the front line. They also, of course, bombard Ukraine. They've just shown that they can do it with any corner of Ukraine. Like a recent day, there was a massive attack with 120 missiles, not counting drones. My hometown of Odessa has been hit on almost daily basis, and nights and days now, including the strike today in the morning Ukrainian time, which led to some people, being killed and being injured as well. So the mood is not good. The winter promises to be the darkest ever, and that's really testing in a major way Ukrainian resilience. But at the same time, as the administration is going to change soon in the United States, some Ukrainians are hopeful. And I need my colleagues across the ocean to understand the mood. The mood is the mood of resentment about the policy of the Biden administration. And that might come as surprising because Biden has been helping and the money is being allocated and the money has been sent, and there's been a pro-Ukraine coalition created and coordinated by Washington, and other things have been done, the sanctions and other things. Of course, the humanitarian aid, not just weapons, being sent to Ukraine by the United States. But at the same time, people are really resenting the whole idea of having no strategy about the war, where it's supposed to lead. Do someone in the White House believe in Ukraine victory or not? If not Ukraine victory, then what? The spoon feeding with weapons, the trickling down of the weapon supply actually exactly at the moment when Ukraine actually needs those weapon supply to be doubling down, being doubled down by the Washington. The fear of escalation always on part of Russia, delayed decisions like this current decision about the weapons being used to attack targets, military targets in Russia, away from the border, a little away from the border. So the decision is being made now, but again, we're hearing it's only about Kursk, and it's only in relation to the North Korean soldiers being there. So Ukrainians are asking, can we use it maybe somewhere else? And it's not clear. So I guess we can go on and on and on. So Ukrainians are basically very bitter about how this aid didn't come in time. The most commonly asked question, like, why didn't we receive all this assistance and aid and weapons, say, in the fall of 22? Instead of much later, so well before the Russians constructed their defensive lines everywhere in the east and the south of Ukraine, and it became pretty hopeless, endeavor for Ukrainian troops to actually do a massive counteroffensive against this formidable defensive lines. So on American, side of the question, though, so this new administration coming to power, and is there a plan? Is there a peace plan? From what I understand and what I hear, there's no plan yet. But it will be done eventually. But I guess it will matter when will this peace plan be actually formulated? Who will be doing it? Is it someone in transition team, and is someone already among the people who will be appointed? Who will be responsible? There's information and rumors that there will be a special representative. Will he oversee it or she will oversee it if someone is appointed? So I guess it would matter. And appointments to some positions matter as well. And people actually were kind of relieved in Ukraine mostly when we heard about Waltz and Rubio. But then again, these people, like one famous Soviet satire writer, he was Oshin in the 1920s, he wrote that this guy fluctuated with the party line. So every time the party line fluctuates and changes, they actually change their position too. So most Republicans including both of those I've named, say in the spring of 22, they were very supportive of Ukraine. But in time, we hear more and more about, yes, we need to end the war, too much money spent, we should pay attention to other issues. China is a priority, and all of those things we're hearing from them more and more, including people like Rubio and Waltz. And of course, not to mention such toxic people as Getz or Hubbard. But even if they're not directly involved in formulating Ukraine policy in Washington, then the critical mass of people who have very toxic view of Ukraine and the negativity about the whole idea of helping Ukraine, this is not a very good development. And I guess the question also that if there is a peace plan, okay, says there is some kind of a peace plan coming out of this administration, and how flexible it will be. Would it actually allow for adjustment, or could it be actually open to negotiations and dialogue? Because obviously what I see myself, and I'm not speaking for all Ukrainians, because some people, like I said, are actually surprisingly, paradoxically hopeful about Trump because they've been tired of, like I said, Biden spoon-feeding Ukraine with assistance. And they think that unpredictable, impulsive Trump can actually do a quick 180. And what he said about Ukraine, during their campaign was rhetorics, was before campaign, because of the campaign, he's going to do something else when he's a president. So a lot of people in Ukraine believe that. I don't, So I think that the Trump really wants a peace deal. And the shortest way to the peace for Trump is to actually pressure and coerce Ukraine into some kind of peace deal, which would not be in Ukraine's interests. And that's going to resonate with Trump's statements. And I don't believe his statements is any kind of campaign rhetorics. I think it reflects his thinking on the issues. And I can trace negativity on Ukraine from Trump for at least last 8 years. So it's not something, which is just tactical or just a nuance. Yes, okay, so he allowed to vote the last massive package of assistance to Ukraine in April with a half a year delay. So he basically lifted his veto, his block, and allowed Speaker Johnson to put it on the vote, and we got the votes, yes. But going forward, of course, I'm not optimistic at all about this Trump administration putting another vote or another package together of helping Ukraine. It might eventually be that there will be some new package, but I don't think it will be as systemic, as massive as the previous packages given to Ukraine in the last 2.5 years. And Ukrainians actually expect more, and we need more than was given to us in the last 2.5 years. But we're going to get less, or we're not going to get anything at all. So that's, I guess, it's harsh reality we are facing right now. And another question with the peace plan, if Russia doesn't like it, and then probably wouldn't like it eventually, like even the most pro-Russian kind of plan that would still not be matching Russian maximalist position right now, confident, of their victory. What would happen then? Would Trump try to find some kind of levers to influence Russian position, some kind of pressure points? Can he find them? Because he said several times, for instance, okay, if Putin continues his aggression despite our peace plan, then we would just flood Ukraine with more weapons. And that's also a promise which is not really matched by reality, in the sense that where would he find those weapons and what kind of weapons? Because actually US is already struggling with finding enough weapons for Ukraine as it is right now. So what kind of weapons and in what numbers he can actually be able physically, feasibly find and send to Ukraine? I don't think that would be too many. And what happens if peace plan is declined, is rejected by both sides, and which is very probable, because Russia would say, no, we want more. And Ukraine would say, no, that's too much. We're giving away too much. So what would Trump administration do? We don't know. And I'm afraid that the simplest way for him still to get to the peace plan, and he seems to be hell bent on actually achieving some kind of peace, quotation marks, is to pressure Ukraine and say, okay, you don't like the plan, but that's the reality on the ground. You should have taken the peace proposal before, like he said during the campaign trail. You should have allowed Russia to attack in the first place, like he said. Zelensky is the one to blame for Russia attacking and so on. So that really reflects his thinking, unfortunately. And for Ukraine, of course, the important issue is about the peace plan. Like, what kind of peace? Is it going to be fair? Probably not. Is it going to be durable? Probably not. So we're kind of talking not really about the big peace treaty, but we're talking about ceasefire maybe. Would our sovereignty be respected in any way, like related to neutrality? which is not looking good or not, right? Related to demilitarization of Ukraine. That's a very dangerous suggestion. Like, would Russia be actually pressing that the Ukrainian army would be like 50,000 the most? That's a way to nowhere. That's really, meaning that we will be in the mercy of Russia at any moment going forward, and that's not what Ukraine would be fine with. The lens for peace principle is not really working ever anywhere, but in case of Ukraine, I don't think working at all as well. What would be the sticking points? There will be many. The demilitarized zone, like now we're hearing that some people in the Trump sphere, so to speak, Trump sphere, talking about Europeans being sent there. Are Europeans ready? They have never volunteered. They never said they're ready. Can it actually work or not? How you freeze down a conflict like this with a scale like this, with I think what it is, it's 1,200 kilometers, I think, the front line. How do you do it? How many peacekeepers you would need from, say, Poland or Britain or something like that? Is it even doable? And Russia wants all these 4 regions, as you know. That's another thing. Would actually someone in Washington tell Ukrainian military to leave Kherson and Zaporizhia, 2 cities that should, and other parts of those regions that Russia wants to be part of Russian Federation? Would someone insist that Ukraine would formally recognize those regions as part of Russia? I hope not, because Ukraine is not going to do it. That's going to be the end for Zelensky. And that's part of the plan for Putin, to put Zelensky in this impossible situation, this very difficult dilemma when whatever choice he makes is a terrible choice. And Zelensky understands that too. He feels that he's cornered and betrayed, backstabbed. And I'll probably kind of stop here. But Ukrainians are trying many things now with Trump. They're hoping that flattery might work. You're the greatest, stable genius, great diplomat. So we expect you to resolve the problems. Thank you. We also want this war to end. Obviously, no one more than Ukrainians want this war to end, obviously. So, okay, if you want to end it, that we are with you. So, okay, great, thanks. Do you want to project the image of greatness and strength or weakness? And Trump would probably say, well, of course, greatness and strength. So, okay, if you just give Russia too much, if you throw Ukraine under the bus, you're projecting the image of weakness, and your reputation will be stained. We understand kind of that you don't really care about international order or defending democracy against authoritarian. You're not big on this pro-Ukraine coalition of countries that the current administration put together in place. We all understand that, but maybe you wouldn't like to be seen in a light like Biden was seen because of Afghanistan in August of 21, and Ukraine. The loss of Ukraine would be much bigger in scale and repercussions and implications for U.S. power in the world going forward for years, if not decades. All right, so yeah, and then maybe we'll try to to kind of relay those notions to Trump and his team about the greatness, about the the weakness, that he shouldn't project weakness. And also, I think the most final thing, I think we should actually continue to explain that there is a connection, between supporting Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia and what you're trying to do with China and what you're trying to do with Iran. This new concept of new axis of evil is actually a real thing. So if you wanna weaken China, okay, or Iran and be tough on them, you actually try to weaken Russia as well and support Ukraine as such. So I mean, Ukrainians are trying, but we'll see if it sticks at all, if it works or not.
Thank you, Volodymyr. And finally, we will hear from David Hirtzenhohn, who is overseeing coverage of Russia's war in Ukraine, as well as the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for the Washington Post. Before joining the Post in August 2022, he worked for 6 years as chief Brussels correspondent for Politico Europe, where he covered the European Union, European politics and policy, including Brexit, NATO, and transatlantic relations. He's a native of Flushing, Queens, and worked for more than 20 years at the New York Times as a Metro reporter and a Washington correspondent, and as foreign correspondent based in Moscow from 2011 to 2015. He also covered Ukraine's Maidan Revolution, and he's now based in Brussels. David?
Thanks very much, Elise. Let me say thanks to you and the Harriman Institute and to Columbia and to Josh and NYU and the Jordan Center for organizing this great event and for the invitation. I want to tell you a little bit, and in fact, I'm not in Brussels at the moment. I'm at Harvard for a Nieman Fellowship, just to be full disclosure, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so not far away. And and enjoying the academic environment for a change that some of you might take for granted. But I want to tell you a little bit about the resources that the Washington Post has dedicated to Russia. Just a quick start by way of some stage setting. There are 4 correspondents and a full-time researcher dedicated to Russia coverage, an investigative reporter who's based in London, and then 3 correspondents who would normally be based in our Moscow bureau, and since Russia's full-scale invasion have been based 2 in Riga, bureau chief and researcher, 1 in Berlin, 1 in London. But Robin Dixon, our bureau chief, and Francesca Ebel, one of our correspondents, have been going back to Russia regularly for extended reporting trips, weeks at a time. And I tell you this because I want you to understand that anything I explain or conclusions that I draw is really rooted in this journalistic work and the commitment to the Post. This is aside from 3 correspondents and local journalists in Ukraine covering the war nonstop. But that at the Post, even after Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal was arrested and detained, our reporters have continued to go back at quite a bit of peril to themselves, trying to keep a conversation going with Russia, talking to Russian officials. In fact, Francesca was in a meeting with Dmitry Peskov the day after the Trump administration said that the president-elect had talked to Putin. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But I want to pick up on something Catherine said, which is not only is this a low moment, and it's always a low moment, as you said, at the start of administrations, but the United States and Russia are dangerously close to outright war, the closest they've been at any point since the Cold War. And we need to keep this in mind. Every time there's an announcement like the change in policy on ATACMS, you saw the barrage of drones, missiles, et cetera, that have been redirected at Ukraine. Russia reacts angrily and tries to make a demonstration point there. But I want to tell you first about, as we think about Russia and US relations, we need to also consider that Russia is a very different country than it was even when Trump left office. This is a lot of what we've dedicated our last year to at the Washington Post was because so much attention was focused on the war, on the devastation of Ukrainian cities, on the invasion, the violence. Little attention was being paid to sweeping changes happening in Russia itself. And so I've shared links. I hope Josh will share those to a series called Russia Remastered that we did. Of course, there were already huge changes underway immediately after the invasion, a historic exodus of Russians. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is Putin using this war to completely reshape his country and the mindset of his people. It's now a militaristic society. There have been crackdowns across all spheres in culture. Imagine how Russia is known for its culture, and having artists, writers tell us that, in fact, Kremlin policy is crushing Russian culture to death, that the role of women, this kind of trad wife strategy that Putin has adopted, telling women to have many, many babies and put them in service of the Russian Federation, send them off to war. The youth, again, militarization in the educational sphere, all the partnership programs that had existed with the West being cut, and campuses that were potential bastions of opposition voices or liberalism have really been transformed into a yes crowd that is right-wing, towing the Kremlin line. So this is a very different country that Trump and his administration will now have to be engaging with. The final piece in this series that we did was looking ahead at the future. And what we heard from a lot of experts like those on this panel, is that it's very, very difficult to see a modus vivendi with Russia under the current circumstances, that there may be a need to get back to the kind of containment policy that George Kennan was advocating in the post-war, early Cold War period. And we'll come back around to that in a second. But this society, I wrote a book about Alexei Navalny that published just over a year ago, 4 months before his death. It wasn't intended to become an obituary, sadly. That's what had happened. But one of the things I remind people about Navalny is that even if he had survived, his political career was over. He had come out forcefully against this war. It took a while. A lot of mixed messages around Crimea. We remember the sausage sandwich being passed back and forth. But in fact, he'd come out firmly against this war. And you now have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of women in Russia, people in Russia who are being told that their husbands brothers, sons, boyfriends are dying in a war that is absolutely necessary. And there is going to be no persuading them that that isn't true, given the high casualty count that Volodymyr was just talking about. As painful as it is, we know that Russia prides itself on the suffering, on the casualties it took in the Great Patriotic War, on its ability to withstand all sorts of Western pressure, including sanctions. And I want to come back to sanctions in a second. But just to start out, and sorry to bring the journalists' cynicism here, but also a reality check. There is a mismatch in perceptions at the moment between these two countries. This is not the rivalry kind of Hollywood legacy of the Cold War that Americans are used to. Russians now see the United States as their enemy, and they're told this every day. And this is a message that is being entrenched in society for generations to come. We hear this parroted back to us, our reporters do, from young Russians who see NATO in the West and the United States as the enemy. This war is Washington's fault. It is continuing only because Washington continues to supply weapons. It's a great irony, given that we all know that Biden's policy of providing just enough weapons to prevent Ukraine from losing, but not enough weapons to ever allow Ukraine to win, has been hugely costly, especially costly in Ukrainian lives. And that's, Volodymyr mentioned the sort of grim unhappiness that comes with that, despite the gratitude for the help, how it just hasn't been quite enough. And so I want to fill in a couple of gaps here in terms of these mismatched expectations as we start to ask this question of what would a second Trump administration look like. On the sanctions front, no question that Trump would like to make deals and that sanctions are an area where he has some latitude, not entire latitude, but some latitude to ease the pressure on Putin. I agree very much with Angela, her point. Catherine has also said this: Russia is not under as great pressure as everybody thinks. It has slowed the war machine. It has hardly stopped it. But there have been other unintended consequences that will complicate the picture as everyone thinks about sanctions. The war in Ukraine for Russia has been an astonishing anti-corruption tool. Why? Because suddenly Putin wanted the Ministry of Defense using its budget to actually buy and produce weapons. So corrupt officials were being swept out, checks were being made, accountability measures put in place that for decades didn't exist when there was mass theft. And so the Ministry of Defense is now operating more efficiently than ever, actually putting resources to use, resupplying, rebuilding, and rearming the troops on the front. At the same time, sanctions have proven to be a corruption enabler. Why? Because Western companies have fled Russia, have pulled out. Those businesses happily taken over, seized many of them by the Kremlin and given off to cronies. And for the normal anti-corruption tools in the West to work, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US or the UK Bribery Act, you need Western actors who are actually worried about being sued in Western courts, about losing their business. And so there are lots of reasons to believe Putin is not entirely unhappy with many of these results. The idea that Russians have been able to take over a lot of these companies, or the idea that Russia has been forced under kind of fire sale conditions to find new markets for its gas and its oil, increased purchases by China, India, Saudi Arabia. You know this because, in fact, the green push against climate change in Europe was going to diminish that market anyway. And so some of this pain was to be expected. And in the process, he's also in pursuit of this larger political goal that he's always had in Ukraine. Whenever folks would ask me, what does Putin want in Ukraine? I said, you're asking the wrong question. What Putin wants is Ukraine. And if he can't have it, he's very happy to destroy Ukraine. Now, another mismatch. We mentioned earlier the nominee for Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a distinguished senator. And it reminds me this moment of when I was based in Moscow and had conversations with people about then Secretary of State John Kerry. Once upon a time, I covered Congress for the New York Times, spent many years on Capitol Hill. I have huge respect for John Kerry. And I know that if you ask John Kerry any question about Senate procedure, he knows absolutely every detail about Senate procedure. If you ask Sergei Lavrov about UN procedure in the Security Council, he knows every detail there. What's more useful? There's always been an imbalance between the way Russia's diplomats are prepared to engage and the way Americans are prepared to engage, whether that's how many Russians at the table speak English versus how many Americans at the table speak Russian, or as we saw in the first Trump administration, and some of this interaction will be helpful. We know, reporting recently about how Trump is taking phone calls himself. Everybody seems to have his phone number. He loves to do this solo show. And we saw it in Hamburg. I was there at the G20 when he first met Vladimir Putin. We saw it again in Helsinki. I was also at that wild summit. And Putin likes to freelance, and there is obviously a great danger there because Trump likes to freelance, and Putin is highly prepared all the time. And I think we may see more of this in the years ahead. A quick thought on NATO, which folks mentioned, and again, the unpredictability here, because while the common line that you'll read in newspapers, including the Washington Post, is Trump is a NATO skeptic, by the time he left office, he was pro-NATO. In fact, I'd written a story about Jens Stoltenberg and his Trump mission accomplished because he'd gotten Trump to say that, in fact, NATO was not irrelevant, that the money was pouring into the coffers. Now, Trump does not understand, has never understood how NATO financing works or how it's counted. That was maybe an annoying thing for some folks, but it may prove hugely useful as he comes back now and learns that 23 of the 32 NATO allies are meeting the 2% goal. Of course, this is entirely tied to their spending on behalf of Ukraine, but he will gladly take credit for having beaten NATO allies into coughing up money, and he could easily be persuaded by the new Secretary General, Mark Rutte, that in fact, NATO has gotten its act in gear. And so for NATO allies, but also for the Kremlin, obviously, the big peril in a Trump administration is the sheer unpredictability, that no one knows what he is going to do from one moment to the next. No one knows if there will be any consistency in the policy. We have every reason to believe that he wants to make deals, but what would he get out of those deals? What would he get for the United States? Is there anything he can get? And is there anything that Putin actually is willing to settle for that is less than his full aims? Knowing that even if he doesn't get what he wants now, he's more than willing to come back in 2, 4, or 8 years' time. I remember I was on the ground in Crimea in 2014 when the Little Green Men showed up, and then was back in Moscow where I was based, went to a briefing at the US Embassy, and American officials pointed out at that moment, they thought it was a good opportunity for a history lesson, that the United States had never recognized the Baltics as Soviet republics, and that the occupation and annexation of Crimea would similarly not be recognized. And I said, okay, I get it. You're willing to wait 70 years to get your Crimea back. Of course, now that will apply to the 18 to 20% of Ukraine that is currently occupied if Ukraine is forced into a land for peace deal. I'm not sure that's possible, given the political peril for a lot of folks, Zelensky first and foremost. But we do have a sense of if Ukraine is forced to the table, we do have a sense of what the contours of a deal might look like. None of them are necessarily good for Ukraine, but we know it would involve some sort of armistice, whether it's East Germany, West Germany style, North Korea, South Korea, a sort of agree to disagree on where the actual boundaries lie, even though, in fact, any land for peace agreement would allow Putin to claim victory, which he wants to do and wants to be back, obviously, on the world stage in a very big way. Looking ahead beyond that, we will see this question of, can Europe step up? It's hard to see at the moment. Again, I spent time covering Brussels. Schultz with this phone call the other day. I'm not sure what he was trying to do or what he accomplished. Macron also politically weakened at home. I think his potential to act is a little bit underestimated because he is the president of France in a strong presidency through into 2027. So we'll see what actually happens there. But the other big wild card as we look at these at these power politics, of course, is the rivalry, and there is a rivalry between Xi and Putin for who is the big bad man authoritarian on the world stage. And we see that playing out in China's discomfort with North Korea's role. Trump may see opportunity to get into a dialogue with Xi that pushes for some kind of agreement in Ukraine that might come at the cost of Ukraine, perhaps, but also potentially at the cost of prestige for Putin, who is, of course, looking to emerge from this, claiming Russia to be as great as ever and back on the world stage. So maybe I'll stop there because I know we want to get to questions, but really some great points that have been made by all of my co-panelists.
Great. Thanks so much to everybody for the comments. This was incredibly illuminating. We are a little short on time. Everyone was doing such a good job of illuminating us that we went over a bit more than we expected. So we have about 15 minutes right now. We don't have many questions in the Q&A. So what I thought I might do is pose a couple of big general questions, but also give each of the panelists a chance to respond if they wanted to respond to anything that anybody else had said. Or to one of the big general questions. So one question we do have in the Q&A is related to the question of what a security guarantee actually looks like if it doesn't end up being NATO membership, and how much that sort of plays into Putin's hand. The big picture question I just kind of throw out, if any of you or all of you want to address, is what, to tell us in the audience, what are the one or two big things you're looking for in the first months of the new Trump administration to try to reduce your own uncertainty about where things are going? Now, granted, one thing that's been consistent across all of this is that the sort of modus operandi of Trump, it tends to be uncertainty. But what are you going to be watching for in February, March, April to try to get a handle on which of the myriad of scenarios that we've been thinking about here are likely to play out? And as well, if you want to just respond to something that has been brought up since you spoke by one of the other panelists, that's fine too as well. So figure you each have about 3 minutes to respond to this and go in either direction that you would like. So Angela, why don't we just go in the same order since everybody had a chance to hear what everyone else has said. So Angela?
Okay, well, thank you. I mean, the really thorny issue with security guarantees is, short of an Article 5 type guarantee, which is that if Russia attacks Ukraine again, assuming that there's a ceasefire and the war at is over, that Putin would have to believe that you would actually have a kinetic response from NATO. And so far, as we know, Russia has not directly attacked any NATO member in this war, even though it's harassed the Poles and the Romanians and things like that. And anything like short of that act as a real deterrent to Russia. Now, the bilateral security guarantees that have been signed between the United States, between different European countries and Ukraine, all offer it, military support going forward, continued weapons, other kinds of support, arming it to the teeth, if you like, but without promising that they would actually come to Ukraine's assistance with troops, weapons, whatever, but particularly with troops, were Russia to attack again, and that Russia would then be in a war with those countries too. And short of that, Putin can always test, and that's what he's been doing. And so far, Putin has deterred the West from doing more. It's deterred the United States. We've already heard about that today. Yes, we're now allowing, finally, Ukraine to use some of those ATACMS, but in a limited way. And so there is no security guarantee like NATO membership, even though there are variations that can bring it closer, but there is nothing like an Article 5. What I'm looking for, well, I will be looking in the first couple of months to see whether actually Trump secures a meeting with Putin. I'm sure that that's one of the things, assuming that we believe what he's saying now, that he would want, how the Russians respond, and how that dialogue goes. Clearly, I'm also going to be looking for what happens to U.S. support for Ukraine in the next Congress, and whether that continues, and if it doesn't continue, how it's discontinued. Those are the things I'm looking for. And the final thing I'll say, I understand what you were saying, Catherine, about how we judge the economy. I would just say that there are a lot of contradictory trends that we can see, and a lot of arguments about how well the Russian economy is doing. Sergei Alexashenko and Vladislav Inozemtsev have just published an interesting report for CASE, where they argue, it's called Dictator's Reliable Rear, but where they argue that the Russian economy is really doing quite well, and they don't see any crisis coming for the next 3 to 6 years. They're well-respected economists, but of course there are other economists, including in this country, who would contradict that.
Thanks, Angela. Catherine?
Sure. So I can take that up in a sec. But so I agree on the security guarantees, and I noticed the question in the Q&A. Josh is also points out that if there's active conflict or occupation of a potential member state's territory, that has to be resolved before they could join. So, I mean, not impossible, I suppose, that NATO could change that, but it seems unlikely given, Hungary it requires complete consent, complete agreement, right? Just as the European Union does. I know that there are people suggesting that they should have a session of the European Union negotiations. Rose Gotto-Muller, for example, who's currently my colleague here at Stanford, who was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO until about 4 years ago, saying that if the EU accession talks and NATO membership proceeds at the same rate, then, even if it takes the Ukrainians 10, 15 years to be able to actually join NATO, this is enough of a deterrent for Russia. I don't know if that's true, but that is one idea. I think what I would be looking for, especially with respect to Ukraine, is let's expect Rubio gets confirmed, and that there is a new special representative on Ukraine, and there is the initiation of some shuttle diplomacy. So I think that Putin's isolation is likely to end. I think Trump and Putin are going to talk, whether we like it or not, or whether the Kremlin acknowledges it or not. Did they talk? Who knows? Why lie about it? So I think that's very likely to happen. Trump doesn't like to be embarrassed, humiliated, or upstaged, and it does strike me as we watch the lightning speed with which his cabinet appointments are coming out, and just absolutely some of them unexpected. We might put it mildly. There's a real in-your-face attitude and real confidence. So I just wonder if he's going to show the same thing to Putin. We could, of course, supply security guarantees short of NATO membership, but boy, would they ever have to be robust. Okay, on the economy, yes, Alexashenko is respected economist, was deputy central bank chairman, I think, until a couple of years ago. But there are others who are also working in the central bank. So the Bell article is based, I think, on that I was referring to is based on an analysis by Prokopenko, who is also in the central bank. So yes, very much conflicting. However, there is a labor shortage. There is a demographic crisis when you're losing 700,000 to 800,000, either through casualties that are so bad people can't go back to fight in Ukraine, or deaths, on top of a negative birth rate, which is the conservatism that David referred to. Women should have babies for Russia. I think this long-term prospects are not good economically. So there is leverage there, and I think that we could potentially have some with China pressuring Putin to ease up on this, and even India. But if Trump is going to slap tariffs on China, then I think we lose that leverage. So there, not a kind of scattered answer to big questions.
Thanks, Catherine. Volodya? Volodya, you seem to be frozen before we had heard you.
Yeah, worse than Angela described it. It may be more than Article 5 guarantees now for Ukraine, because even in NATO, Article 5 guarantees allows countries to choose how to assist a certain member state under attack. And what Ukraine needs is even more binding and triggering and committing guarantees, and that's not what we're gonna get. So what we're gonna get, I guess, is that we are gonna get these packages of security assistance that we have signed with a number of countries, including US. The problem with US, of course, is executive agreement, so it has no money and no say but the Congress, and of course, Trump just can undo it easily, what we've signed with US, I think in the late May this year. Yeah, so then I think there is going to be a combination of the security assistances given to Ukraine by various countries, so basically a coalition of willing, plus some militarization of Ukraine, I'm afraid to say, because it's could be detrimental to the inherent democratic character of Ukraine if we go forward, but that's, I guess, the future, militarization of Ukraine, further militarization plus some security assistance given. That's going to be the best solution for us, realistically speaking. Yes, and what I'm going to look at in the coming months, well, let's see what happens with what Putin does, because, of course, if indeed Trump talked to him and asked him to be restrained and not to escalate, that's not what Putin is doing. He's actually escalating. So we'll see what kind of reaction there will be from the current administration and also from this team that Trump is assembling. Because, of course, what we saw as a reaction yesterday when the news were broken about the permission to strike Russia by more longer distance fire weapons, there was this abuse, the wave of abuse of Biden by the inner circle of Trump as someone who is pushing US to the Third World War and so on, and warmongering and so on. And I think we will have to see how much of the influence the inner circle of Trump would have, which worries me more than people who pointed to certain positions. And I'm talking about people like Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson and David Sachs and Donald Jr. and others, who have direct access to the president, and they're very toxic and negative on Ukraine, and they might be much more influential in terms of shaping up the policy of Donald Trump than, say, Rubio or Waltz, even because they pointed to certain positions. We'll see, and I think in the coming weeks also, what will be important what happens in Kursk. Is Russia successful in pushing Ukrainian troops out or not? Will we continue to have this chip, bargaining chip at least, going forward, Ukraine or not, how it's going to play out as well. So that's it.
Thanks, Volodya. David with the last word.
Sure. So on security guarantees, I think my co-panelists have said it all quite well. We've not seen any evidence that anything would be more than a veneer, right? And there's a limit to how much anyone can trust the Russian Federation on these sorts of agreements. We've seen agreements like the Minsk Accords get weaponized in the past. So I'd be very curious how artfully they attempt to construct something that looks like a security guarantee, but short of saying that any further invasion or encroachment on Ukraine would be a declaration of war against NATO. It's hard to see how it amounts to much. I'd promised to come back to our meeting, the post meeting with Peskov, as the two administrations were giving different accounts of this phone call that did or didn't take place. And he was quite emphatic with our correspondent that there had been no phone call, and expressed dismay that he hadn't been contacted in advance. In fact, he had been messaged in advance and then complained that, well, it was a day off because it happened over the weekend. But I mean, let's stop and pause and dwell on this for 1 second. You have two leaders, two administrations that are known for using lies and gaslighting the public, not just journalists, as a legitimate tool of their government administration. And they also happen to control the world's largest nuclear arsenals. Like, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, I sat there looking at some of these messages just dumbfounded. Like, who do we believe in that circumstance? I mean, when they're literally saying, one says up and one says down, one says yes, one says no. It's just quite stunning. And I think we're going to be in for more moments like that, where you just look at this and say, how could this possibly be? And on the other hand, to Angela's point earlier, every administration has come in saying that it intends to, other than Biden, it was already clear how bad things were, that it intends to reset Russian relations. And this is why the closing conclusion, I think, of the experts that we had interviewed, that Robin Dixon and Michael Berman, one of the Post's State Department reporters, had interviewed in this Russia Remastered series about what's the way going forward, is that we're likely to see some kind of a containment strategy because there is simply no way to make the interests meet. There may be temporary measures. Again, there may be great power politics involving India and China, but in fact, Putin wants territory and Ukraine doesn't want to give up territory. There's like little way to split that baby. So we'll see where we end up, but prognosis seems quite dark.
All right. On that upbeat note, let me thank our panelists for helping us to sort through what is an evolving and extremely complex situation. We are grateful for their expertise. We're grateful for them taking their time with us today. I would also like to thank all of you for taking your time with us today, this afternoon, to join us for this conversation. I'd like to thank Elise Giuliano from Harriman Institute for co-hosting along with me. And I would also like, again, to thank the Carnegie Corporation of New York for sponsoring this. Our next edition we'll have one more in 2024, though we haven't set the topic yet, but our next edition for the New York City Russia Public Policy Series is set to be December 11th. It'll be back on our normal Wednesdays. We hope as many of you as possible can join us then, and we look forward to all of our panelists to welcoming you back to the Jordan Center and to Harriman in the future and for continued conversation. Thanks all very much for your time today. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.